Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar where we have gathered an inspirational and very competent panel to both discuss, but hopefully also teach us something about where we stand when it comes to the battery industry and market. We wanted to gather people from many different sides of the battery industry, both those who work hands-on with how we create and build the digital tools for a transparent value chain, but also those who build the factories, educate the students that will do many of the jobs we will need someone to do. And we will also touch on access to raw materials, and of course, we will talk about the emission issues and environmental challenges. My name is Ingrid Johanne Stenberg. I'm the Communications Director for ONS, Offshore Northern Seas, the leading energy meeting place. We gather close to 70,000 people every other year in Stavanger, Norway, and from being a meeting place focused on oil and gas previously, we are now a lot more. In 2014, we had Elon Musk visiting ONS, and when he was on stage, he gave us the following thought experiment. If you have a nuclear plant and you instead build solar power on the same area, and in addition, you also build solar power in the security zone around the nuclear plant, this solar power will generate the equal amount of energy. The only issue, or there are of course many issues when you're building that much energy, but the main issue was of course the regulating of the power. How do you make sure that you can store the energy and provide energy when needed? Solar is an intermittent power source, and and the energy storage and batteries have been one of the main issues for dealing with this in a large scale. Since that, we have evolved quite a bit. The batteries and the battery industry has evolved quite a bit, and also the regulations and the government are struggling a bit to keep up, but we've seen a lot of development. So has ONS, and this year we have a full program not only on the energy industry at large, but on solar power, battery and energy storage, offshore wind, hydrogen, CCS in our net zero markets arena. And in addition, we also have the technical sessions where energy efficiency, emission reductions in oil and gas will have great focus, and not to forget our international market session. And important for the battery industry, but also other renewable actors, is our scale-ups arena for up-and-coming companies in the energy industry. We hope to see many renewable energy companies there. All the corporate venture companies are there, the private equity companies are there, and so on. So that will be an exciting place to be. And it makes a lot of sense to talk about batteries at ONS because we see it as a major part of the bigger picture. But where are we today? What's left to do to actually get the ball starting to roll in a big way? This day, I have with me a unique panel, a European-focused panel for most part, but with a global outlook, I like to think. They will help us explore a little bit more about what we need to do to build a sustainable battery ecosystem or ecosystems. And to kick it off, we have Eugenio Longo. He's the Sustainability Director in TCS Europe. And he will share a more overall situation report and the need for a cross-sector ecosystem. And with that, Eugenio, the virtual floor is yours.
I'll see my first slide. Oops. Let's make it full screen. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Can you see my slide? All perfect. Okay. Yes, my name is Eugenio Longo. The name is very Italian, but I was actually born in Canada, and most of my career I did in Europe, in Italy and Austria, Belgium. And I worked mostly in the chemical industry, the plastics industry, and started looking at the sustainability challenges of plastics already in 2007, since I was working for a packaging company, which you all know is quite challenging to make plastic packaging circular. But then I went to work for Borealis in 2012, which is a major producer of plastics in the world, in Europe and in the world. And there I started tackling the issues around plastics, but the circularity of plastics, but perhaps in other sectors than just the packaging. And this is where I came about talking about batteries and their components, because since a lot of the parts of the battery will be made out of plastic. But in 2012, I decided to join TCS, which is a digitalization company, which is quite different from the plastic industry. But I'm fascinated by the enabling capabilities of digitalization when it comes to the circular economy, to fighting climate change. So I think it's a very nice career move, and it's actually very fascinating to work now on this twin transition, the digital green transition. So the first slide I'm going to share with you is to tell you the advantages, the sustainability advantages of electrical vehicles. And as you can see from the two first points, this information comes practically from two sources: an NGO called Transport Environment and the European Public Health Association. And this information is quite staggering. You can see the real advantages of an electrical car. First of all, the emissions to make the car and to use the car, the improvement in emissions with respect to what we have today, which is diesel or petroleum, is between 22 and 28% reduction in emissions. If you are in the worst scenario. The worst scenario is a scenario where you use mostly coal, either to produce energy or to produce energy to make the car. But if you go in a very favorable environment like Sweden, where a lot of the energy is renewable to make the car again and to use the car or to charge the car, the advantages go in the order of 80%. Anyways, you can, in LCA, the problem with life cycle assessments is that if you change the boundary conditions, the results may change. So I wouldn't make a big deal about the numbers themselves, but as you can see, there is a significant reduction in the worst condition, but also, and obviously also in the best of conditions. So there is a reduction of CO2 emission, and this is the primary aim of moving mobility from fuels to electrification. But we also have to look at other advantages, which are very much of concern to the public health sector, which is the particles. Obviously, the electrical car has no tail emissions, and the particles that we emit from the combustion of fossil fuel are quite detrimental to the health of the public health of people, or public health in general, especially in dense areas of countries and cities, and yes, in cities mainly. So the amount of particles are reduced significantly, and this is obviously very important. There's also some reduction of emissions from braking, also from the brakes and also from the tires. But I didn't mention that in the slide, but it's also to be taken into account. Obviously, another big advantage is that these batteries can be considered as energy sinks. If we digitalize one day the electrical network, and we could understand when there's an abundant amount of renewable energy in the network, and be informed that that's the right moment to charge your car. If you start combining all of these concepts, you kind of understand that the battery could become a sink, an energy sink, where you can store the energy. So you have a combined effect, mobility and energy storage, that could be exploited further in the future. So that's the untapped potential of the electrical car. Obviously, the biggest untapped potential of the electrical car is that when the network in Europe or around the world will become rich in renewable energy, then obviously all of this will make even more sense. But there are challenges. As you can see, the 3 points that I've detached from the 4 points above, they're important challenges. We should never underestimate them. The transformation that the electrical car brings to the automotive and energy sector is tremendous. If you read on LinkedIn, there's a lot of people that are stakeholders that are worried about the introduction of electrical vehicle, because they don't know where this whole market of vehicles will go in the future. Will countries like Italy or Germany or France be winners or losers in this new scenario? This is something that worries a lot the industry, but also the workers, the people that work in this industry. So change is not always, there's always some risk to change, and those risks need to be mitigated. We need to be prepared for that. Obviously, also the energy sector is very much impacted because you're not distributing fuels anymore, but electricity, so you need charging stations. And also that is a tremendous change in the way we fuel our mobility. And this is not to be underestimated. There's a lot of challenges around that. Then when we talk about Europe specifically, there's important supply challenges in terms of the raw materials to make the batteries, but also the components. When I worked at Borealis, we already started discussing this topic of capacitor films, which are used in electrical batteries. This is already a challenge for us in Europe. So we have raw material and the component challenges because they are actually not made in Europe. And we have also the overall issue of having these batteries produced in Europe, which we will hear about more in the next presentation. And the last point, which is the one which is really, really important, because it would be totally unproductive at the beginning of introducing a new product like an electrical vehicle, introducing this new product on the market, not making it circular from the beginning. And most car parts are actually quite circular. If you look at the statistics in Europe of how much of a car can be recycled and is recycled, the numbers are quite high. But if you introduce an electrical battery in there, the risk is that the battery is not recycled. And this is the risk that we need to mitigate. We need to make this industry circular from scratch, from the beginning. So how do we solve these sustainability issues? Well, this is a point of view from TCS, is that we believe that especially the circularity problems, but not only, also the renewable energy problems, could only be solved by having an ecosystem approach, because there's no single organization that could solve the recyclability problem of the battery, because it will require that the battery is designed for recycling. You're going to have to be connected with the recycler and understand how they will recycle them. So you need to create an ecosystem, and actually you need to do this with all your stakeholders. So this is why, again, at TCS, we believe that in most cases, you need to establish a cross-sectorial ecosystem to resolve these big or important sustainability challenges. In the case of battery, certainly it is about a cross-sector ecosystem. You will need all the sectors of the economy to solve the issues that I've mentioned in the first slide. Why? Because you will need regulation that regulates the way you make, the way you use, and the way you dispose of these batteries. So you will need to work with the regulators, but you will also need to work with industry. And industry will need to be engaged and actually interface itself with these other stakeholders to develop the circular economy of the batteries. But you will need to do research and development, you will need to do investments, and you will need to engage with the more general community, with the consumers, to make understand how these batteries need to be used and how they need to be disposed of. So as you can see, you very easily, when you start tackling important sustainability issues, you end up in understanding that you need to involve all the stakeholders to involve the issues. As you can see there, I even mentioned the NGOs here in the cross-sector ecosystem. That's important because the NGOs will make you understand the concerns of society towards the product and what needs to be addressed. So you need to put all of these stakeholders together. Now, I don't want to do clustering of stakeholders and a cross-sectorial ecosystem, but it's very important that industry organizes itself in organizing one cluster, right? And then this cluster should be working in parallel with the NGOs, with the governments. And you will see it, it's nicely represented and actually applied in the Global Battery Alliance, which Torsten will present later on. And as I said before, as I just said, excuse me, the Global Battery Alliance is a very good example of a platform which represents the industry, but that will eventually interface itself with government institutes and NGOs to exchange all the necessary data and to build a circular economy around the batteries. And obviously, as you can see at the bottom, you've got the entire value chain that needs to be orchestrated and coordinated in such a way that these batteries ultimately are reused and recycled properly and that they don't end up in the environment. Because to solve one problem of climate, we might end up in a problem which is about contamination of soils of the environment. So we don't want to run that risk. And as I said, Thorsten will present this in great details in the next presentation. Now, the last slide is about connectivity, because if you want to run these ecosystems, and this is where digitalization and TCS comes into play, not only TCS, but all the companies that work in the field of digitalization, is that to enable these ecosystems, you will need to connect. You will need to connect the dots. You will need to exchange data, and all of that will require digital tools. So it is very important to, when you have you start developing your ecosystem, that you right away start thinking about the architecture, the IT, the digital infrastructures, but mostly the architecture, which is required to manage this ecosystem. Or else it becomes a monumental exercise to do this without digitalization in the old world, if I may say. And in fact, there's been so many efforts in the past to try to turn certain products circular, and the failure is often caused by the fact that there's too many stakeholders to coordinate, too much data to exchange. It's too complex as a whole, and it is impossible to coordinate all these stakeholders without digitalization. So this is where digitalization comes into play. It is an enabler of an ecosystem for sustainability. This is my conclusion for my part, and perhaps we can go to Thorsten.
Thank you, Eugenio. Before we move on, we will have a Q&A session later, and if you have any questions, so please write them in the chat. Our next panelist has already received a little nod from Eugenio. Torsten Freund has background from the chemical industry. He is now head of project management in the Global Battery Alliance, which started as a World Economic Forum initiative back in the days. Not that long ago, though. This is still a young industry. We are very much looking forward to hear more details on how the alliance works to actually make the value chains transparent, and especially through a battery passport, which is one of the most concrete and specific efforts that we now see. So, Torsten?
So can you hear me now? Can you see me? Fantastic. So thank you very much for this kind invitation and introduction here to this topic. So Eugenio has already talked through some of the important points if it comes now to the transition of our classical society. We talk all about energy. Today, energy is provided by burning fossil fuels, and no matter what the resources are abundant, the consequences are quite harsh if we look at the climate, what we are experiencing every day by ourselves. So the first and foremost biggest lever will be providing access to renewable energies. Renewable energies produced by wind, solar, water power, and whatever we can invent. However, in the difference between fossil fuels and electricity produced by renewables is that electricity needs to be stored, and here comes battery into play. So with that said, batteries will be the key role for the energy transition. However, they come with a lot of trouble. So first and foremost, batteries need materials coming from some of the scarce resources in the Earth's crust. Therefore, keeping those precious materials in the loop is of key importance, and therefore we will not be able to run a battery-driven society without talking about circularity at the same point in time. With the circularity in the battery value chain, processes will be developed for recovering materials from batteries, and batteries will be designed that they enable already the recycling by their design. However, that must be replenished from natural resources in the initial part. And here we have other issues to face. So in manufacturing of batteries, the carbon footprint will play a major role. Therefore, we are talking about processes, how to change from carbon-driven manufacturing processes to electrical-driven manufacturing processes, as well as process efficiency. But we talk about mostly about complete change of manufacturing. The other aspect is that to prolong the life of a battery. The longer this material is in use as a storage device, as it can be repaired or used not only in cars, but also in storage facilities, the longer we can use those materials and have no further demand for virgin materials. And another aspect is the social arena. So materials come from mining, and mining does happen quite frequently in parts of the world where social responsibility is not at the core of the policy. Therefore, we strive as a Global Battery Alliance to enable socially responsible access to raw materials, free of child labor, respecting human rights, and even make it happen. So therefore, under the World Economic Forum in 2017, a small group of institutions has assembled, which is now growing, I would say almost daily, to now more than 100 organizations coming from different sectors. And as Eugene already has pointed out, we need to bring together not only the industry players, but also non-governmental representatives of civil society. We need to have the legislators on board. We need to have the thought leaders. We need to have technology providers which enable the implementation of transparency. And all those are assembling under the roof of GBA in a pre-competitive multi-stakeholder access, combining their strength to strive for a sustainable and responsible battery ecosystem. So when saying this, the ecosystem desperately needs, first and foremost, transparency. What's happening in the environmental, social, and governance space that can be monitored in an accurate manner. And once you can monitor the environmental, social, and governance performance, you can benchmark individual processes, individual value chains in respect for that performance, whether they are delivering on sustainable, circular, and responsible criteria. And tracking this over the time in a validated manner will really tell you, are our measures we are taking really on the spot and help to create this new ecosystem. And this is really a transition from the classical way of doing business into a new way of doing business. So what we have in our hands is to control actively the input, the data which are providing the transparency. And as an immediate outcome, we can demonstrate the knowledge and awareness about the value chain. With this awareness, people see how they perform in their own mirror and change behavior and practice. With the change of behavior, we hope to come to a change of the state of affairs in a responsible and sustainable manner that in the end, over the time, the overarching objective of a sustainable and responsible value chain will be achieved. In practice, the transparency provision looks quite complicated. So first and foremost, we need to discuss about what are we going to measure. So is it greenhouse gas footprint? Is it about child labor? And that information needs to be tracked through a quite complex value chain, which is then consolidated into the information the single battery has. So all the materials in the upstream must report in a content way that is comparable between the individual players. Therefore, Global Battery Alliance has set out to negotiate common standards that we are reporting in the same formats. And then this information can be tracked by various traceability tools. And here the IT comes into play. So we need to get the information from a cobalt mine in Congo, or from a lithium mine in Chile, or from a nickel mine in Indonesia. This information needs to be in a understandable and standardized manner transferred into the battery, which may be manufactured in Mo Iran, for example. And with that information, with the battery, then you can issue the digital twin of the battery. Therefore, the digital twin will be an equivalent in the real world with the existing digital world. The digital tool will accompany a battery throughout its life cycle. Further information can be stored about the history of charging, state of health of battery, and at the end of the use in, for example, the vehicle or the stationary storage, the battery will provide the information to the recycler, how it can be recycled, what type of materials are in there, how it can be disassembled, and that can have two impacts. Number one is finding the right processes and most efficient processes, and number two is steering the battery into the existing value chains. Once we have this information for the single battery about the entire value chain, there can be an interaction between the players in the value chain with an assurance platform, which we plan for GBA. So with that information exchange, the individual players will receive the information where they stand on the level playing field. Where is their performance with respect to their peers in a peer-to-peer review, which is still anonymized. So the individual players will receive their own performance only and the comparison with the market average. Auditors will confirm data. That is, will be really a key part here, that auditors can say, this is an accurate information and you can trust the information. Legislators will have better insight how to derive standards and thresholds for compliance. NGOs will have a better understanding where are the levers, where can projects really bring added value. And last but most important, the general public gets an information in the format which is adequate to make purchase decisions. And only if we change our behavior in purchasing and handling our products, that will really drive the change throughout the value chain, through the OEM, back into the mine. And as Eugenia already said, this is really a task which no one can do alone. And Global Battery Alliance assembles all those stakeholders together who will manage, and I'm very optimistic that together we will build these ecosystems for the future that enable a sustainable and responsible value chain, ensuring the comfort of social living with access to energy for everyone who needs it. And only if we are playing together that will happen. And that's my key message. Let's do it together today.
Thank you, Torsten. With that massive challenge to grab, I'm gonna center the ball directly over to Tilman Valle. We're very lucky to have him with us. He works with Systemic and more specific, the project Battery Pass in Germany. So this is, now we're going really into the specifics. I'm gonna ask the rest of the panelists to keep it to your allotted time, just so we may have time for questions after. But Tilman, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Inga, Jana. And can everybody hear me as well and see my screen? Wonderful. Excellent. A hard act to follow up on with Torsten, as always, and also Eugenia's great sketching of the challenges and opportunities. So I want to take my time today to tell you a little bit about first, who is Systemic, why am I here, and what are we doing in Battery Pass, and building on the reason that and the foundation of what Battery Pass is as a project, which is the battery regulation, which is such an important frame for the European and thus also global battery ecosystem to evolve, as my previous two speakers have sketched today. So starting off with, for your reference, Systemic, we are an impact-making organization. We were founded 2016 in reaction to the Paris Agreement and have since then grown to over 300 staff globally with 7 offices centered around London, Munich, Jakarta, Amsterdam, Paris, and Sao Paulo. and this year likely opening Brussels and Berlin offices as well. So seeing quite a strong expansion. What we do is that we cooperate with those that want to trailblaze changing systems globally to accelerate that transition to sustainable economies, to sustainable systems, as we call them, meaning the businesses, the technologies, the societal practices, the legal frameworks that we need in order to change our footprints to a minimal one and hopefully stay within planetary boundaries for the better of mankind. And we work across the whole spectrum of environmental sustainability, including on materials management, on energy, on biodiversity. We invest, we consult, we do analytics and run consortia. And that is one that I would like to drive deeper down today, the Battery Pass. Now, the Battery Pass is one project that we have initiated together with a group of collaborators and partners, including also the Global Battery Alliance, to advance the creation of the European Battery Passport as by the Battery Regulation. The Battery Regulation is a milestone piece of legislation, really, fostered or driven forward by the European Commission, put forward 2 years ago as a draft, and is currently in the final negotiation rounds between the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament. Is expected to be passed this summer and will supersede the currently active battery directive. A few key elements that make this such an important piece of legislation, which is worth dwelling on, is that for one, as a regulation, as a legal form of regulation, it will take direct effect equally and across the entire European Union and EA, and therefore immediately once passed will enforce and implement what is written in it, as opposed to directives which will require delegated acts in all individual member states, will take a long time to roll out. The regulation will take effect very fast and very consistently, which is great to get that homogenized market going. And it also content-wise contains so many important provisions that really make it a very trailblazing, very important piece of legislation, including supporting second life applications of batteries, as Eugenio pointed out so well before, including phasing in over time reasonably high quotas of recycled materials to be applied in the batteries, therefore also kickstarting that market for transparently marking recyclates and then creating a market for trading these, and of course reducing our raw material consumption over time. Then requiring mandatory human rights due diligence, a lot of what Torsten talked about, right? Like responsible supply chain transparency and action to really improve and optimize the environmental impacts that batteries have. And make no mistakes, all human activities have environmental impacts. We always will have a footprint, but we must take care that we minimize it, and the battery regulation sets out a lot of important facets to that. There's plenty of other elements to that are very exciting to go into, but today I want to focus on the battery passport, which is mandated by the battery regulation. So besides the voluntary force that the GBA collects and channels forward with its members, which is incredibly applaudable and that we're building on and working with, the regulation will actually require battery passports to be implemented in all batteries larger than 2 kilowatt hours that will come to the European market starting 2026. And so that could be stationary, car, industrial, or other batteries as long as they're larger than 2 kilowatt hours. So it will be basically a tool that will be finding very, very broad coverage. And so the work that GBA has been doing is of great asset to start filling that out. And Battery Pass, the project that Systemic has initiated together with its partners, it takes this one step further, and together with GBA and other partners intends to really advance the comprehensive nature of the Battery Pass and consolidate the various activities that our partners and many others have already been doing in a way that we will be able to efficiently set up and implement the Battery Pass ports in all these batteries by the time that the regulation takes effect. So what we'll do is we will work on to develop content and technical standards and guidelines that will describe how organizations, companies generally, have to report into the battery passport, how it will be structured, what governance requirements will be set into it, and thus build on the work of the Global Battery Alliance, especially on these specific points on CO2 and responsible sourcing, on some of the government's criteria to cover the broader approaches to making this happen. And so you see here our partners to the right-hand side. We were very lucky to convince the German government and secure 8 million euros in research funding from the battery research grant that comes from the Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Protection, that sees that need for that concerted action. And so with that funding, we are able now to put our full force behind actually pushing this forward as a European, pan-European, and ultimately global effort. This is a German group that is not working for a German battery passport, but rather we want to make proposals into the European discourse for the wider then discussion, finalization, and ultimately implementation. And so there also we're welcoming further associated and contributing partners along the way. And with that, I'd like to close and hand over to my next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tilman. It's very interesting to see how the process is it's moving forward, and we might even get some news from you the months ahead, hopefully. One of those that most likely will have to relate to this in some way or another is our next speaker, Hege Marie Norheim from Freyr. For you, those of you who don't know Freyr, it's a Norwegian company listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And interesting to note, the name Freyr is from Norse mythology. It's the ruler of peace and fertility, rain and sunshine, and son of the sea god Njord. And I wanted to reference to Hege Marie's former employer, or back in the days, Statoil, and now Equinor. They have an oil platform called Njord out in the North Sea. So now we're actually seeing building on the shoulders of Njord into Freyr. And what's exciting about Freyr, they're now in the process of developing a lithium battery factory in Mo i Rana that Hege Marie will tell us more about. And we are very excited to hear more about how the work is going and why you're doing it in Norway, in Mo i Rana, and how it looks from your point of view, the building of a sustainable battery ecosystem. So please, Hege Marie, she works with sustainability and communications in Freyr. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Inger Johanne. Pleasure to be here. And as you understand, an incredible, interesting industry to be part of, with a lot of things to relate to going forward and interest. And I would say very commendable work going on that the three gentlemen ahead of me have been explaining. So you are right. Freyr is, we're 4 years old, not even. When I joined a year ago, we were 23 people. By the end of this year, we will be 300. We will be probably more than 1,000 2 years from now. We are scaling at in blitz scaling, which is great fun and also very challenging. And we're obviously doing that because we are out of time as a world to provide, to decarbonize the transport sector as well as the power sector, which is really our mission and vision as a company. We are listed on the New York Stock Exchange, which is also very interesting, to put it that way, for a small startup with some very challenging requirements already from the capital market, but also opportunities, of course. We are building 5 factories, actually, Johanne, in Mo i Rana, which is almost directly under the polar circle in Norway. We are also have also said that we will look into, and we have a plot in Finland to start a factory there, as well as a partner and a joint venture ongoing in the US with similar ambitions of starting battery cell production in the US. So our guiding to the market has been that we will hopefully produce around 83 gigawatt hours of battery cells per year in 2028, which is only 6 years away. And we are already building the first pilot plant in Mo i Rana, and we're in the final weeks of making the investment decision for the first 2 gigafactories in Mo i Rana. And we are a member of the Global Battery Alliance, and we're very proud of that. Quite recent, given our history, obviously, but very impressed following that work. And hopefully, we will also be able to help out and give inputs from our side, because of course, what is very important. This is really important to Freyr, because our whole go-to-market position is that we will base our own production on renewable energy. And we are going to work with our suppliers to bring down the carbon footprint, because we feel that a battery in itself has such an amazing impact in decarbonizing for our customers. We also, of course, need to have decarbonized batteries per se. I think what we really need to keep in mind, though, which I don't think has really been mentioned yet, is the scaling of what we're about to see. So as far as I understand, in 2020, the world produced around 350 gigawatt hours of batteries. Our projections, what we're looking at, is a scaling towards 21,000 gigawatt hours of batteries in 2040, so 18 years from now. That is a 60 times more demand for batteries per year than what we saw in 2020. And that, of course, makes everything we're talking about, we need to think about the scaling of that, is really going to have a massive impact, definitely on the job creation that we are creating as an industry, because much of this will be originating through battery cell production in Europe and in the US. So in the West, because today most of batteries are produced in Asia. So that's one big move, and that creates jobs, which is the green shift, which is really exactly what we want. But again, it is not, it really matters that this is based on use of renewable energy. But it also will scale our supply chain. And that is really something, that is exactly what we are addressing in today's call. The challenges that we already see in the supply chain, both in terms of quality and capacity, are going to be then challenged massively going forward, but also, of course, the ESG, the environmental and social and governance issues surrounding our supply chain has only just begun. And it's clearly for Freyr, where we are going to focus most of our sustainability work is in the partnership with our suppliers. We're very, very supportive of and impressed by the EU's efforts to make this matter, doing the right thing, both on climate as well as on human rights and other issues should be valuable and profitable, and should make you more competitive. And that is exactly, I think, what we're seeing happening in the EU through the EU legislation, as well as the work that we are hopefully going to succeed with in the Global Battery Alliance, and are very close to. There's an amazing job that has been done already. And I just want to say, so maybe then my one slide. What I think is for us, really important in addressing then some of the challenges in the supply chain is energy. And the reason for that is because this is an energy intensive industry. Can you see my slide now, Inger Johanne? Okay. So this is an attempt to show how energy intensive it actually is. To your left, you will see the value chain in terms of the mining extraction part, and what constitutes the costs of that phase in the value chain. The next is the chemical processing, and then cell production, which is what Freyr will be doing, and then the totality of it. And the dark blue is the energy cost, the cost of energy as part of the total. As you can see at the end product of one battery cell, energy costs, or the energy cost constitutes 44% on world average of a battery cell cost. In our part of the production, which is then going to be renewable energy, it's a fairly important component, but even more so in the step ahead of us, the mineral processing and chemical processing part of the industry, which is what we will then be working very closely with to take down the carbon emissions of the chemical processing and mining parts, mainly by trying to incentivize the energy switch from coal-based or gas-based or fossil-based energy mixes, where this is now today often the case, and actually co-investing with our suppliers to establish them in areas and our goal is in the Nordics, so that they will also be using renewable energy as us, and hence decarbonizing our batteries. And also, of course, then securing our supply more locally than what will be our challenge today. I just wanted also to say that briefly on recycling, which is clearly incredibly important, and a strategic issue has always been for batteries and will also be for the lithium-ion batteries. But I do want to remind us that, as I said, with the scaling of potentially 40, 50, 60 times per year production or annual production, a battery will hopefully live for 20 years, 15, 20 years, meaning that in 20 years from now, in 2042, we will only have the production of 350 gigawatt hours that were produced and sold in 2020 to recycle. It is a massive timeline lag before we will have those materials coming back to us at the scale that we will need them. So for the next 20 years, there will hardly be any recycled lithium-ion battery material available. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't set it up and make sure that we create that ecosystem. Absolutely. And we will do our part, but we will have to scale the supply industry from elsewhere over the next 10, 15 years. Just to build a bridge to the next speaker, Inger Johanne, I do want to say that we are scaling as a company, but we are going to totally change Mo i Rana, where we're building our 5 factories. They have 26,000 people today. We will bring in about 1,500 workers for the 5 factories with families at the Arctic Circle. We believe there's no unemployment in the area, so they will all be moving in. We will have to build houses. We will have to build kindergartens, schools, English-speaking schools, jobs for the spouses of our employees. The prediction is that the city will grow with somewhere between 30 and 40%. And it's an interesting challenge to have to finance all of this before people arrive and set it up and make it attractive. And then, of course, for us, it will be key not only to attract people, but to train them, because we do not expect that many of them will have battery competence or battery production competence, as well as retain them, make them happy and integrated into the city where they arrive. So on that note, over to you again.
Thank you so much. It's very inspiring and interesting story you're about, and the journey you're about to enter. It's a nice pass over to our next speaker, Odan Torvald. He is a professor at the Norwegian University of Technology and Science in Trondheim, and has many students eager to focus their studies on batteries. He has also been a part of the competence mapping done in Norway with regards of the development of the battery industry. And in addition, he is probably the one person among us, I think, with the most knowledge of the battery cells themselves, the chemistry of it all, the different uses, and has research and publications on battery cells, electric vehicles, life cycle for batteries, and much more. So who else to tell us more about how prepared we are for this massive, massive scaling to build the ecosystem with the people we need? Odan.
Thank you very much, Inger Johanne, for that very nice introduction. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen and my cursor, the red dot? Inger, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So I thought today I'd talk about 3 things. Some perspectives on an emerging industry, why Nordic energy economies, and maybe a little bit about the sourcing and production footprint of this industry. So my background is really in engineering, and I was so excited about the science and technology of engineering. So I sort of followed up with a PhD and a couple postdocs in the field before I ended up as a professor at NTNU some 8 years ago. As a part of my interest for energy storage, when you think about this example that you mentioned at the introduction of Elon Musk, storing energy from renewable energy is really, really critical. So as a part of this, I set up a book that we use for most of our courses. And the activity that we have at NTNU is really between understanding global perspectives down to production and engineering and materials down to nano level. So it's really on a scale from 10 to minus 9 to 10 to the power of 9 in what we try and accomplish. So when you think about European car industry, and if you think about those that are within the EU, so the Volkswagen Group, Mercedes, Benz, BMW, Citroën, Peugeot, and Fiat, in 2019, they sold 25 million cars. And if you have a car of 60 kilowatt hour, which is a good sized car, not the largest, but sort of intermediate, and you produce somewhat 32 gigawatt hours of batteries annually at the factory, then you need 50 factories, gigafactories, just for the car segment. And we see that down here. Another segment that is also equally important, maybe it will grow a little bit later, but that's the stationary storage, and it will be ballpark the same size. So then we need 100 gigawatt factories just for the European segment. And then there's another sort of 20% on top of that. So we need something like 120 factories in Europe by 2040. And these factories are really large, and some of them are like 1 by 2 kilometers, like the Norfolk factory. So some people occasionally ask me, I heard that there's plans for 20, 30 gigawatt factories in Europe. Do you think that will be a challenge with respect to oversaturating the market? And no, you need 6 times as many. So this is an industry that is really growing big. The thing that I will talk a little bit about now is the challenge on supplying engineers to this segment. So if Norway is to have, say, 10% of this value chain, then we need 12 of these factories in the next 10, 15 years. So that requires a lot of study places. And a thing that is often overlooked, I think, in Norway is that these students has to be granted study places by the government in Norway. So with the current prospect of 3 to 4 such gigawatt hour factories in Norway, by 2025, maybe it doubles by 2030 or triples. Then we need something like 1,500 to 2,000 workers per plant. And depending on the level of automatization you're doing this, you need 20 to 60% engineers. So that's quite a huge task. So by 25, there is an estimate that you need ballpark 2,000 battery engineers. Perhaps they don't necessarily all come from battery focused area, but maybe it's adjacent fields like cybernetics or production or process engineering. But we need probably to triple that by 2030. And so here's an overview of how some people think that the distribution of engineers and vocational workers will be in these plants. And to get the engineers for this, it's really 3 pathways. So one is to say that we set up new permanent study seats that target this industry. And if we do that today, it will take 3 to 6 years before they're graduates. And currently, it's not really given new students, but the capacity for, or study seats, but the capacity for doing this is as large as the government decides, really. The other thing we can do is to change our existing programs. And by having more professors active in this field and having small courses into the existing programs, then we see, at least at NTNU, that here we can ramp up the graduation rate of maybe 100 candidates annually. But it still takes 1 to 3 years before we really do that. The third option is further education. So that's education for engineers who work in a different field, maybe oil and gas, who knows. But here we have a capacity to really take a big part of these needed engineers, and we can do it now. And in fact, we're doing it in May now, where we have a course of on battery engineering batteries. But the point is that in order for this to sort of be manageable and maybe sustainable in terms of not cannibalizing too much on other industries, as you're kind of doing if you're taking engineers from one field and putting them into another, is that we need to have more study places and quite quickly so. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and this goes maybe a bit back to the first slide on the first talk, is if we look at cars, and I think in Norway we think about electric cars as a really big part of the segment because we have so many of them. And if we think of a conventional diesel engine, there's some emission, and that's sort of the gray one here as a reference. And then we see emission of tons of CO2 equivalents. And then you see the driving range of the car with an estimated end at 180,000 kilometers. So if you have a small car, it will emit less than a large car. So a small car could be like a Fiat Punto, and an F segment car could be more almost like a Hummer or really large SUV. So if we compare the segment of conventional internal combustion engine vehicles to different energy supplies in the electrification of it, we see that the CO2 emission of cars is currently higher for electric vehicles than it is for conventional vehicles. So if we look at how this develops throughout the lifetime of a vehicle, and if you have an energy economy where the electricity is purely coal, then you will emit more CO2 throughout the lifetime of the vehicle than you will for a conventional car. Of course, there's no economies that run solely on coal, so this is kind of like a worst case scenario. And it was mentioned Poland, that even in Poland, which is fairly heavy on coal, you will have a reduction in CO2 emission because they also have other sources than that. But if you move from coal to power to natural gas for power production, then you will see a reduction only by that. And if you instead have renewable energy like wind or hydro or PV, that's when you start to see a significant drop in CO2 emission through the lifetime of a battery electric vehicle. And depending on whether you look at a large car or a small car, you can see a reduction to maybe a fifth. So that's 80% reduction in energy consumption. But if we do the battery cell production in energy economies that use renewable energy, then the CO2 footprint of these vehicles will be lower at the point when you produce them, even when they reach the market. And that's when you can see 90% ballpark reduction in CO2 emission throughout the lifetime of battery electric vehicles. So when you make batteries, what you do usually, and what we've done for the last 30 years, is that you mix your active material, Maybe this is a bit nerdy, but and then you sort of put it onto a thin film that you dry, and this drying actually consumes a lot of energy. And next you calender it and you put it into different pieces and assemble it in cells. Now, if we look at the cost of this production process on this axis here, and we look at the CO2 emission on this axis here, we see that, for instance, Jaipur in India is fairly expensive because electricity is expensive there, and because they have a very coal and oil-based heavy energy economy, the CO2 emissions are really large. If we compare with instance from the city of Braunschweig in Germany, then the CO2 emission comes down a lot, but because electricity is very expensive, then you see expensive battery production. Now, if we look at the example of Oslo, which is Norway, then you can see a fairly large reduction of the cost, because energy has traditionally been very cheap in Norway. And you see that the axis here goes down to 60 and not to 0. So there's a focus on the window area here. But we also see that because the energy economy is so heavily focused on renewable energy, it's by far the location where you will see the lowest CO2 emissions of these examples. And I think Norway is an example of the Nordic countries where we have a lot of renewable energy. And gradually these countries will also come down in CO2 emission as their energy economies change in terms of the mix of energy sources. But it means that from an environmental point of view, starting battery production in the Nordic countries is the wise thing to do. And then as these other countries come down in CO2 emission in their economies, then it's a good time to build up production there as well. Because as I said initially, we're going to need a lot of these factories in Europe. So driving battery electric vehicles in renewable energy economies is really good. And to set up factories in these renewable energy economies is also a good thing. And it's where we should start doing it. Another example which comes to mineral sourcing. So this is a study that we did with some of our PhD students. And we sort of look at the different sources of materials, and we sort of pinpoint different processes that goes on in the different segments. And then we get to a point when you have a precursor for battery production ready. So the example of nickel and mining nickel and smelting and refining nickel, you see that the electricity intensity in terms of how much CO2 you emit per kilowatt hour of electricity, that's what's really giving the impact of emission from extraction. And so recovery efficiency in the processing is also important. So to recover more mineral means that you have lower emission during making these materials. But the most important thing is the energy economy where you extract them. So when we look at mining and beneficiation, we look at the melting and refining and the total impacts, then we see that the global average for nickel relates something like 14 kilogram CO2 equivalents per kilogram nickel. In the Asian segment, you see this reaching up to even as high as above 30, which is twice the global average. But if we can do this in the Nordic regions, as we see being done in Finland and Sweden, then you have a third of the CO2 emissions as you have compared to the more extremes, and 2/3 of the global average. So the take-home message here is not only to drive battery electric vehicles in renewable energy economies, it's not only to set up the factories for making the batteries in these economies, but it's also to mine and produce these minerals in renewable economies. And that's the end of my presentation today. So with that, I thank you for the attention. Thanks.
Thank you. It's very interesting. We needed some battery geeking as well at the end there. And it's very interesting to hear about the scaling challenges we're meeting. And I wanted to ask Hege Maria, now we're going into the Q&A, we'll talk a little bit now. We have a few minutes left. Hege Maria, when you hear, when you say that you want renewable power to make the batteries and you want your suppliers to use renewable energy, and in addition you hear this about raw materials being less emitted if we take it or mine it in the Nordics, how is it actually possible to do?
So I guess we think about our supply chain as two main parts. One is the mining, and then it's the processing part. And the processing part is definitely possible to do. And we've already announced a joint venture with a Taiwan company to produce the cathode material in Norway or in Finland, in the Nordics, basically. It's a very energy intensive part of our supply chain and eventually then of our battery. And it would be really important part or piece for us to get in place in order to take down the carbon footprint of every battery cell we produce. So, and we see that the current Asian producers, mainly in the processing part of this industry, are very interested in getting a foot into Europe or into the US, because they absolutely see as well this demand increase, and they do understand that being then getting their carbon footprint down and getting sort of their ESG as well in place for European and US requirements and customers would be very beneficial. And we are willing to co-invest because we believe that this securing the supply will be very important. I think when it comes to mining, we're back to not in my backyard challenges, aren't we? It's going to be, I mean, both in mining and in growing renewable energy in Europe per se is going to be, I think, a challenge. I would say, though, that, and it's interesting because as Odan showed, and as I was also saying, you know, we do expect that the energy storage part of the growth in demand is going to be as big as electrical vehicles. So Freyr, for example, will be selling the first, first two factories for sure to producers of solar and wind power plants, to accompany and help solar and wind with their intermittency challenges, and hence, you know, greening the grid. But they are, as customers, are much less keen to discuss how green our batteries are compared to the electrical vehicle producers. You know, the car makers are very, very onto this issue on the ESG footprint of a battery, but the solar and wind power producers are not. And I find that really, really interesting.
It's a paradox.
Yes.
Moving on to a different challenge, we started the whole session with a lot on the framework and the things we need to have in place, the systems and the digital tools. I have one question that goes on the digital part of this, where when we rely, now we've seen energy security issues in real life happening as we speak in Europe. So how do we make sure that we not only, one thing is making ourselves dependent on raw materials, but also making ourselves dependent on digital solutions and an infrastructure that works, always works, that is secure. It's a different sort of energy security, but how do we make that work? I'll ask you, Eugenio, first, and maybe some of you others will chip in. You're muted.
Correct. So TCS has a point of view on this topic because we participated to the EU consultation. So it's a consultation that was actually put together by the European Commission to better understand how the world of digitalization and energy should work together. And obviously in this position, we kind of explained the opportunities that there are, and that's clear to a lot of the policymakers, but obviously the challenges. And to have the whole energy network managed by IT, artificial intelligence, or all the tools that can be used today, we will need to tackle a number of issues. And one example is data flow, data information, confidentiality about the data. Those are all important topics that need to be addressed. But obviously, the big opportunity is that a network which is more managed by IT and involving the consumer, as Torsten showed, with tools like your iPhone, you can really make understand the consumer when he needs to charge his electrical car, just to put it bluntly, right? And these tools will be key, because there's the fact about the renewable energy is that it creates a network, an energy network, which is much less, yes, it is based on renewable energy, but it's not as stable as the one we have today. The beauty of fossil fuel, and people tend to forget that, it creates a lot of stability. You need more energy, you just burn more fossil fuel. You need less. But when you're dependent on the ecosystem, but I'm talking about the real ecosystem, our environment, that will change. And this demand and supply dialogue between nature and human beings will need IT tools, if I could put it in a figurative way, to make sure that we capture the energy when it's available.
Tilman, you work on this in the very specifics now. Are you by any means concerned about the IT security and so on?
I mean, if I should, then probably completely irrespective of the work on renewable energies. I mean, we're seeing in the ongoing geopolitical conflicts that technical war is a reality today, right? Like that's the dire picture that one could paint. I think the more general realization is, and people have said this for a while, that information is the oil of the 21st century, right? Data and making use of the data is key. And make no mistake, batteries are thoroughly digital, right? Like you couldn't turn on a battery without software, without a battery management system, without chips, right? Like it's not like just like a plug and play battery cell, but the larger batteries are very complex, very digital physical entities. And so it's all about the battery management system, the software, the algorithms that we develop to make them usable, most productive, most efficient, most durable. And so that in itself, in the physical products that we use, that's batteries, renewables, grid, I mean, obviously the electronics that we use requires those skills. And in the last decade or so, Europe has outsourced a lot of that to the US and to Asia, and that's fine, right? I mean, fundamentally in a globalized free market world, what we've seen is like incredible efficiency gains. What we see now, of course, in the new reality is that might be a world that is coming to an end, or it's becoming more, coming into choppy waters. And so I think it's wise by the European nations and by the Commission to think more strategically about not only securing the materials, and that's something that I think we discussed today also already quite amply, and the manufacturing of these, but also about the data and the skills, but also the physical infrastructure to build this and the business models to make use of them. And it doesn't fall from the sky that Amazons and Apples of the world are the most valuable organizations in the world. It's because they have a laser sharp focus on always monetizing and valorizing the data, generating more and really structuring that for value, right? It's all with a purpose to generate new business. And that's, I think, something that we need to keep in mind. Like, what's the data coming from Battery Passport for? Like, what's the use cases? Who can benefit? What can we generate in new businesses and new value? And then we will build that kind of industry also in the European Union, in collaboration with our global international partners. It's not about like raising the walls, far not, but rather like making use of the skills that we have here to make the most use. And it's the data strategy, the EU data strategy, and the work on the EU digital product passports are elements to that ecosystem that are hopefully taking effect and that we want to kind of contribute a bit to.
Talking about the digital infrastructure, what we need in place, there's also a massive lack of software engineers and hardware engineers, IT people, on top of the lack of battery engineers. So how are we able to really scale this? I understand in the, let's say, the Global Battery Alliance, Torsten, are people optimistic in terms of that? It does. That seems like we will need a lot of people.
Absolutely. So this will be certainly the critical part, that we find the right people, and that starts with our kids. We need to attract our kids to digital solutions, or to physical science, to mathematics, chemistry. And once we have managed to take the adversity of our kids from these subjects, and they really enjoy the fun of working in these areas, I strongly believe we will find the right talent in that space. And there will be no one solution to solve all the problems. This will be really a highly complex ecosystem. There must be multiple measures. People is the one thing. Resilience is another topic. If we speak about data security, it's not only about the normal run phase of our ecosystem. What happens if there is a hacker attack? What happens if war becomes digital? What happens with our energy supply, which is really the base of social peace in many of our societies, what we experience today? And there must be resilience. And I think that what is coming up more and more is working on decentralized solutions, which are so many that you can attack maybe one, but the others will still work independently. They have the right fences, and by the architecture, was what Eugenio was saying, we need to get the architecture right from the beginning, and better put some more thought into the design of this ecosystem, and construct it in a robust and resilient manner.
And Odna, you work probably closer to all the young emerging engineers than any of us. Do they want to prioritize batteries, or are there other traits they want to explore more? What's the temperature among the STEM?
Yeah, so the main education program that I'm connected to is one in renewable energy, but we'll and there we certainly see a lot of interest in working with these energy solutions and energy storage, and it's been a huge shift over the last years, also in other programs. Today, I thought I should, if I may. We had a few talks today around blockchains, which essentially creating certificates for different kinds, like we've done with digital money. And I think we're also starting to do that more with energy, not just the hardware. And maybe that can resolve some of the challenges that Hege mentioned earlier about some segments caring more about the certificate than others, when also electric energy becomes more mapped like this. But maybe a thing for someone else to answer is how much of blockchains can we add on these values chains before the certificates and in sort of data mining it gets a significant footprint.
Hege, you raised your hand, but I don't know if you wanted to answer that or something else.
No, I couldn't answer that. Maybe I'm happy to come in afterwards. I wanted to raise another point, Jana.
Yeah. Tilman, I think you have a few meaning, or know a little bit about blockchains, even though you don't like the word.
No, I had to smirk there, right? Like you called me out on that one. I'm all with Odne that the new technical capacities that we're going to develop, new tech and digital capacities can be super useful to, for example, enable automated, island solutions and peer-to-peer trading of energy systems, for example, or automated billing for batteries and smart charging. It's ultimately vital to make that happen, right? I think blockchain in specifically, it is a creation of certificates of largely tamper-proof certificates. It's something that doesn't create magic, though. I like to have it made my practice to ask everybody that speaks about blockchain to tell me that one application that they know cannot be done, absolutely cannot be done otherwise. And I've not heard a reply yet after 3-4 years of doing that. There's generally solutions to things that blockchain solve also for most tasks, like also cryptographic and so on. That said, there's a few applications that are what they're really, really useful, right? Like smart contracting. They need to be part of a smart ecosystem, so right, like really building what you want, where blockchain can be part of it. Now, I think overall, what we'll really need is standards. Sounds a bit dry, but like standards, for example, for smart charging, for charging infrastructure, for the technically really, how does an electric battery or vehicle communicate with the grid, right? And so there's recently an ISO standard that was passed on bidirectional and smart charging and plug-and-play charging, which could revolutionize basically how we move around with electric cars, right? Like plug in and the car does the rest and the charging pole. Today, it's a major hurdle that people want to travel places, but they need like 20 different cards of charging providers. I mean, that's not a situation that can endure, right? And so these kind of standardizations that allow ecosystems and businesses to grow, I think that is really key in the next years.
Hey, Maria, are you glad you didn't have to answer the blockchain question?
Yes, I find getting my head around how we're going to set up Freyr digitally, and what kind of software components and partners we will need to collect data from everywhere and share with everybody is mind-blowing. But I'm sure we're going to make it happen, and we will and it will be very good for Freyr, because we do want to document what we're able to achieve. What I just wanted to draw back to the conversation around lack of competence, capacity, people, and I point out maybe 3 things. One, I do see this as a big, it's meant to be a green shift. So there is other sectors that are going to have to let go of people and, let go of competence, and people who will then have to transfer, and at least, new jobs will not be created there, and what will be created in our new sector. So that is, I think, how it has to be. That is part of shifting the economy, and we should embrace that. And it's great opportunities. And then, secondly, I do think we should also recognize that this means, incredible opportunities for some developing countries who have these resources and minerals that we should not shy away from, but rather really, again, try to help develop that and those resources in a great way for their people and and use their competencies and their capabilities, and build stronger and a better world other places. And then finally, even though Freyr has as a strategy to co-invest close to us in Europe, in the US, with our suppliers, we are not going to solve the climate change challenge for all of us, or for any of us, in Europe and in the US. It has to happen in China, in Asia, in India, in Brazil. So, so even though as of late the world seems to sort of regionalize and secure themselves and sort of become smaller, that's not the way forward, because we are in this boat together. So we need to keep working with our partners globally. And that goes for the Global Battery Alliance as well. We really need to embrace our Chinese and Asian part of the industry.
Yeah, working on that actively.
I know.
With that very inspirational quote from Hege Maria, it's very true that this brings upon a lot of new opportunities for countries that we haven't really thought of into this puzzle before in this way. And with that, I really wanted to thank you. I learned a lot. I hope the people joining us have learned a lot. We never got to talk about sea bottom minerals that we're exploring in Norway, for example. We never got to talk about the real use in the maritime industry, which have been a big thing in Norway, for example, and the cruise industry, and so on and so on. We could talk forever about this, I think. I really hope we can continue this conversation at ONS in Stavanger from 29th of August. We know that there's not one way to net zero, as you have mentioned, so we want to gather all sorts of people from all sorts of industries within energy to talk and meet and find the better solutions, those that the people that work with the maritime solutions, those that developed hydrogen projects, CCS, battery packages on oil platforms, and so on. So with that, I wanted to thank you all, Eugenio, Torsten, Tilman, Hege Marie, and Odna. Thank you very much, and I hope I see you soon.